this series of filters or mediums. The tools they use in their design, management, and operational work. Whether it's hydrographs, crop models, malarious models, decision support tools, there's a whole lot of things in here. And what they're looking for is information that helps them do specific things. Risk assessment, design standards, operating rules, allocations. So there's a delivery process and there's a translation process. It's not outreach. It's a different kind of process. If you combine those two, you end up with a series of these kinds of information flows. Here's the flow between information and the filters, the flow between the filters and the practitioners, complemented by direct outreach between these two, as well as the outreach to the stakeholders. But if all of these things are operating, something else occurs. At least I believe something else occurs, and that is practitioners now become more engaged as extension agents, and they have a different conversation. Theirs is as extension agents to the governments and the institutions they work for, and there's a more direct conversation about policy issues between those governments back to them. As a scientist, it's very unlikely that I'm going to be part of this. And the same will be true with my other scientist colleagues, because they're working out here, and hopefully they're working in here. The extension agents are working in here. You know, just like Al Gore is busy training all these people to deliver a slideshow. I think if we collectively are able to create extension agents, and perhaps some of you who are in this room may be in this box, this conversation can be a way to bring climate science into the decision-making realm. Slowly, incrementally, but in a professional manner, and one which ensures that the practitioner issues are properly dealt with. Issues like best practice, liability, and being able to pass this on in a rigorous way to the next generation of practitioners. Again, things that are going to be very difficult for people in here to initiate on their own. So building the science policy bridge is going to involve this kind of dialogue. The Okanagan Valley is just east of here, about 8,000 square kilometers. It's experiencing very rapid population growth. In 2003, during the drought, the city of Summerlin was in a water crisis and they had to cut off some users. Already, you have a region where most of the streams are fully licensed. They are not allowed to put another license onto that stream. I'm not saying the 2003 drought was because of climate change, but climate change added on to the existing water stress is going to create some issues. Now last week to the meteorologists, I was asked to give a talk called How do you get climate science into decision making and linked to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. So I showed this slide, which begins with this dialogue and this initial display of a climate change impact, which is a hydrograph showing how the stream flow peak, which today occurs in May, will in the future occur earlier, more flow in the winter, less in the summer. It changes the whole seasonal cycle of water. That began another set of analyses to talk about changes in risk between water supply and water demand, that as we move through the scenario, more and more of these years will show up in this upper left corner of the diagram: high demand, low supply, greater risk. At the same time, we had a consulting engineer do an inventory of past, present, and planned infrastructure, water management activities, both dams, meters, education programs, to determine how much water could be saved or spent and what the costs would be. So being able to combine those things led a local planner to put climate change into a local water management plan. This is the Trepanier Landscape Unit Plan. Trepanier is just west of Kelowna. So that is a plan that now has climate change in it. All of that led to a much wider dialogue within the Okanagan on how climate change would affect water management, which led us to be able to create a new group-based model exercise. This lady here, Stacey Langsdale, is a PhD student who recently graduated, and she created a decision support model with the help of local practitioners, irrigators, engineers, municipal planners, Okanagan First Nations, BC Fruit Growers Association, that helped her build this model. This model created diagrams like this, showing how under dry years, supply reduction and demand increase would create major problems. And this yellow bit, which shows how demand could be reduced by residential adaptation, is not enough to stop that drier water shortage. And if you were to solve the problem by putting all of your pipes in Okanagan Lake, the farmers would get the water they need, but the lake level would start to take a hit. So you can't solve your problem by sticking your pipes in the lake. This kind of conversation led the leaders of the water chapter in the 4th assessment report to specifically ask me to send them a text box to include in the water chapter. So from Trout Creek to the IPCC, this is an 8-year journey that involved a shared learning experience that enabled us to create extension agents in the region so that they would see themselves in this expression of a change in risk, and it started with a scenario. Now again, I'm an advocate of that choreography. I'm not saying that that's the only one, because clearly there are others. But I think this is an example of how a dialogue like that can hopefully lead to a policy change which explicitly includes climate change adaptation.
I think you illustrated very clearly that you need to address issues or attempt to incorporate climate change in ways that are relevant to the community or the stakeholder. So you didn't arbitrarily select any old climate change scenario. You didn't talk about average temperature 50 years from now. In the case of a community dealing with water resources, you dealt with peak flows because that's what's relevant, that's what they're vulnerable to. In dealing with municipalities responsible for planning in coastal zone areas or low-lying areas, you deal with sea level rise and things like that. If you're dealing with the forestry sector, you'd probably deal with pine beetle or something else that's definitely climate change related, but is relevant to them because they are vulnerable to it. So I think you illustrated a very important point for your entry into the choreography, and that is you need to have some awareness of what is pertinent and relevant to that community, A, for their engagement, B, so you get the right information you're dealing with it, and C, so you're connected with decision making in those communities. So I think that's an excellent example that you've given.
In Quebec, from the provincial level and the municipal, they've said we are, in some of our infrastructure, we're particularly sensitive to extreme precipitation events. Now, notwithstanding the effort to go through Uranus and Environment Canada and all these other groups to get better estimates of change in this type of extreme event, they were only able to get vague characterizations of change in the past and rather weak expectations for the future. Nonetheless, I'm not quite sure how they did it, but they said this is enough of a risk to capture it in our structural guidelines. We're going to increase them an arbitrary number, 10% or something this way. Now, if that 10% increase in the guideline had meant that it was a major cost, huge cost relative to overcoming the risks that you're going to try and avoid, then they probably wouldn't have done it. So here is one example only of a process by which an existing institutional arrangement, building structural guidelines, design features, was modified in a somewhat arbitrary way to capture a risk associated with climate change, and a risk not well captured within global climate change scenarios, but for which nonetheless we have some idea that it's something that may well change with climate change. Now, I don't know what lesson you draw from that, but I think there are some lessons from that because it represents an actual adaptation at a municipal level influenced by a higher level of government, drawing on available climate information and so forth, but undertaken in a way now it's in place.
I'm going to throw out the idea that this preoccupation, this dwelling on the specifics of climate data, projections, model outputs, and their certainty and what have you, is actually a hindrance to taking action.
Hear, hear.
And the point I'm making here is that if you look how decisions are actually made in engineering, in planning, in economics and so forth, they don't expect certainty in these numbers. They don't need it. The planning processes, if we actually looked at those sometime in a session like this, they assume that there's uncertainty. They recognize that. That's why they use things like risk assessment and so forth. And it would seem to me that the process of facilitating adaptation would be advanced if more attention was given to actually how is it that decision makers at municipal levels and others make such decisions? How are these things incorporated into it? And there are many, many examples of how they are and are not incorporated in areas, and municipalities and other jurisdictions across Canada and around the world are doing this all the time. How they're incorporating risk associated with climate change into their water supply decisions, into their floodplain planning, into their design, their building design guidelines, into their road and bridge construction, into their healthcare programs even public health in the event of heat emergencies, and so forth. So I think there's a real opportunity to learn from experience, but if the interest is in how is it that municipalities can incorporate, mainstream, adopt these issues into it, we need to give a bit of attention to the processes and mechanisms by which those institutions work.